Evening, everyone. It's me again, Akil, and sorry for the long delay, but better late than never. I am back now. Let me just jump into a topic that I've already touched on, which is, of course, the controversy. Well, what once was the controversy over the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and which has since become a larger conversation about the problem of police brutality and police abuse in America, particularly as it affects young black and brown men in particular. Because, as is widely known, this particular problem tends to affect people of that background or those backgrounds most of all, disproportionately. I want to say first that I'm glad to see that there has been a continuance of the protest and the outcry over the injustices that that often occur in this area. Now, let me make it clear that while I still think the evidence, the available evidence at least, in the Michael Brown case could lend itself to either interpretation, and a colorable, legitimate argument could be made that the grand jury made the right decision in refusing to bring charges in that case, although I'm not really sold on that idea. I do think that, if you look at other incidents that have ended in no indictments for the police officers involved, such as the killing of Eric Garner in New York City, I think it's a lot harder to say that not even allowing those cases to go to trial was justified. And of course, just generally, this is a problem that is widespread across this country, and I might add in a number of other societies as well. This is by no means a strictly American problem. But of course, we are speaking in an American context here. I'm speaking in an American context, and so that's what I'll focus on. I'm really glad to see that people are keeping up the heat. I don't agree with all of the tactics used by all of the protesters who are trying to speak out on this issue. For example, I've heard in recent days and weeks about protests in places like New York that involved some protesters trying to occupy various department stores and business establishments of that nature. I don't really agree with those kinds of tactics, partly because they tend to prevent ordinary people from going on about their business, and partly because they target institutions that might be involved in certain racial injustices or general social injustices, but that aren't directly involved in this particular type of injustice, namely police brutality. So that's just one example of a protest tactic with which I don't agree. But generally speaking, I'm glad to see that people are keeping the heat up, keeping up the pressure, and keeping this issue at the forefront of the public consciousness. Of course, they've had a lot of help doing that by the news, by circumstances, because cases like this one keep occurring and grabbing a lot of media attention thanks to what happened in Missouri and the ultimate outcome. Now, that's not to say that this kind of incident is occurring any more frequently now than it happened in the past. I think what's happening is that people are paying more attention to it. People are waking up to it. And we're starting to see some rather unusual suspects, if you will, beginning to acknowledge that there is a problem, or at least that there might be a problem. So, for example, within the past week, if I'm not mistaken, we've heard conservative commentators and figures from, Speaker of the House John Boehner to pundits like Michael Savage and other voices from the right wing of the political spectrum who have been saying, "Oh, I don't know about this grand jury decision in the Eric Garner case in New York City." The Michael Brown case was one thing, but we all saw that video of those police choking out, well, that police officer, Officer Pantaleo, choking out Eric Garner unto death. And it's a lot harder to understand that decision. Former President George W. Bush said the same thing in a recent interview, saying he found the grand jury's decision hard to believe. That's a big concession for people of that political background to make. And while some of us might be tempted to throw up our hands or dismiss what they're saying and refuse to give them any kind of credit for it, I think it's a better idea to give them at least a smidgen or a modicum of credit for it, because we want to give people the right incentives. We want people who normally would reflexively side with the police, and I'm thinking mainly of political conservatives here, to rethink that posture and start recognizing that if you really believe in limited government and small, minimally intrusive government, you have to limit the power of the police, and you have to hold them accountable for the ways in which they go about enforcing the laws that politicians put on the books to control people's lives and tell them what to do. at a minimum, you have to limit the power of the police and be very vigilant about the ways in which they exercise that power and that authority. Otherwise, you can't have really limited government. So the more we can get people who believe in limited government in some way, shape, or form to recognize that reality, the sooner we can get them to act on it and build the kinds of coalitions, cross-partisan, cross-ideological coalitions that will be necessary in order to tackle this problem and implement the necessary reforms. So I think we should give people like Michael Savage and George W. Bush and John Boehner and the rest a pat on the back. We should give them an attaboy for even conceding that the grand jury's decision, even just in the Eric Garner case, may have been wrong. It remains to be seen what will come of the case in Cleveland, Ohio, in which two police officers shot dead a 12-year-old black boy, Tamir Rice, who was playing with a toy gun that they mistook for a real one. We've seen that plot before, but it's especially heartbreaking to see a 12-year-old boy lose his life because of that kind of trigger happiness on the part of police officers. But there's a larger issue that's come up in this context that I wanted to address. I'll try and make this quick. It's the issue of systemic racism. Actually, I maybe shouldn't say that there's a debate on this subject. I actually haven't seen much of a debate on it. I do know that in modern academia, there's an idea that's taken hold that the word racism does not mean personal racial prejudice as the traditional understanding or definition of that word would have it. The idea is that racism is a system of oppression. I know that one particular, well, more recently we've seen a CNN comment on this. I was actually reading a CNN article on this subject last week. The title of it is The New Threat, Racism Without Racists. And in that article, they quote Doreen Lowry, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, director of the Pan-African Studies program at Arcadia University near Philadelphia. She says, the first thing we must stop doing is making racism a personal thing and understand that it is a system of advantage based on race. Now, I'll be totally honest with you. I've never fully bought in. In fact, I've never bought in at all to this newfangled notion that racism is purely systemic and not personal. For one thing, it strikes me as the kind of rewriting of the dictionary that's often popular in left-wing academic circles that I've never really embraced with any enthusiasm. Even in cases where I think a change of terminology is called for, I tend to be hard to convince on that subject. Changing the meanings of words for reasons of, whether you want to call it social justice or political correctness, whatever the case may be, it's something that I always approach really circumspectly and cautiously. In a lot of cases, I think it's just not warranted at all. When it comes to racism, in the past, I've thought that, the whole idea of redefining racism to mean strictly systemic and structural factors in society rather than personal prejudice has always, for a long time, it struck me as just a sort of ruse to hold non-white people to a less stringent moral standard than the standard to which we hold whites when it comes to the question of ethnic prejudice. Every sensible person knows that there are prejudices that exist in every community. People of all backgrounds harbor certain prejudices based on things like race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. The list goes on. But the idea is, I should say my suspicion for a long time was that this redefinition or reframing of racism as a concept was just intended to not let non-white people off the hook entirely, but to hold us to a less demanding standard. It struck me as a way of combating the discourse you often hear among conservatives about reverse racism. The idea being, okay, look, we know that if you're talking, there are black people, for example, who have racial prejudices, who don't like whites or sometimes other non-white communities because of skin color. But at the same time, because of the disparity in wealth and power and political clout and so on between the races in America that persists to this day, we all know that prejudice coming from whites is generally more likely to do damage than prejudice coming from blacks or other minority groups. So we shouldn't pretend, applying the same terminology to prejudices exhibited by members of these different groups risks playing into the whole idea of reverse racism and just distracting our attention from the real fights that need to be fought and the real problems that need to be tackled. So I thought that that goal is worthy, but I don't think that rewriting the dictionary or redefining the word racism is necessary in order to achieve that goal. I think we're better off just making the point instead of rewriting the dictionary in order to make the point. Just say, look, yes, there are blacks who harbor racial prejudices as well, but, you know, for a host of reasons and in a host of ways, prejudice coming from whites is more likely to do real damage and dirt in society than prejudice coming from blacks. Simply because blacks generally occupy a much less privileged and powerful position in society relative to whites. It's as simple as that. Now, that's a somewhat uncharitable interpretation of that whole paradigm that racism is purely structural and systemic rather than personal. And so, you know, in recent months and years, my position on that has softened somewhat, and I'm less inclined to say that the whole thing is just a ruse to let non-white folks off the hook for whatever prejudices we may harbor. But even if that's the case, I still can't go all the way to supporting that paradigm or buying into it. And the reason is that if you look at the way racism plays out in practice in a lot of these cases, such as in the cases of what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, or New York City, or Cleveland, Ohio, people's personal predilections and biases have a lot to do with it. For example, in the Ferguson case, one of the complaints made by the family of Michael Brown and their lawyer and a lot of their sympathizers was that the prosecutor, the district attorney in that case, was biased himself. And the idea is, well, his father was a police officer who himself lost his life to an African-American criminal. And of course, as a prosecutor, he works with the Ferguson Police Department all the time. And so he has a natural bias in their favor. And you find that among prosecutors generally. But, well, there you go. That's exactly the point. I don't think you can chalk up that kind of bias strictly to systemic factors. That's a personal thing. Now, it was never proven, if such a thing can really be firmly or conclusively proven, that, you know, the DA's family history, the fact that his father was a police officer, the fact that his father was killed by a black criminal, we don't know for sure that life experience colored his approach to the case, but it very well might have. It's certainly not hard to imagine that such a thing might influence a public official's decision-making in a case like this. Well, if that accusation is true, then there you go. There's a perfect example of a very deeply personal factor that ended up having what many believe to be, and what I suspect to be, a racially unjust result in a case that concerns police brutality. Now, is there any denying that structural factors are relevant? No. Of course structural factors are relevant as well. You've got, in the case like Ferguson, Missouri, according to what I've read, part of the reason that relations between the black community and the police are so bad is that the police keep basically shaking people down for their money. They harass people constantly, particularly blacks, giving them parking tickets for jaywalking, all sorts of petty offenses, partly to pad the police department's budget. And believe me, I know from experience in some of the internships I've done in the past at organizations like the Cato Institute and the Institute for Justice, that it's not above, police departments are not above shaking people down for money. It happens all the time, and they do it in countless different ways. Asset forfeiture abuse, a lot of the arrests and stops for petty offenses like the ones I just mentioned in Ferguson. It happens all the time. It's a very believable claim. And so, obviously systemic factors are relevant. Of course, we also have other policies like the war on drugs, the mandatory minimum sentences, and the disparities in those sentences that end up basically stuffing America's prisons with young black men, often for nonviolent crimes and for crimes that whites commit at the same rates, but for which blacks are disproportionately targeted. I mean, the list goes on. So there's no denying that there are systemic and structural factors that contribute to these problems, that sometimes cause the problems from the get-go, and that just generally exacerbate them, that make them worse. But at the same time, every system ultimately comes down to people. Every system is ultimately made up of flesh and blood human beings, each one of whom brings his or her own biases and frailties to the task at hand, to the job that he or she does. So, for example, in the Ferguson case, I suspect that one of the problems with the grand jury's decision was that, grand jurors and jurors in general in the society, a great many Americans, simply, are biased in favor of the police in these kinds of incidents. We've already seen a lot of publications since this whole controversy erupted last summer, pointing out that, American society is still highly segregated in many ways. White and black Americans, to a large degree, still live very separate lives. And so a lot of white Americans have a hard time empathizing with African Americans and others who fall victim to police abuse on a regular basis. That I think is personal as much as it is systemic. I'm not denying the systemic dimension of the problem, but I think there's a personal dimension as well that needs to be taken into account. When you're talking about a grand jury that's evaluating a case like what happened to Eric Garner in New York City, these are X number of flesh and blood men and women who have to make a call. Do we call for an indictment in this case or not? And if these people are biased in favor of police officers, even in a situation like that one, in which it's pretty clear that the police, just from the video footage, that the police used excessive force against this man and cost him his life for no good reason, if jurors can be biased in favor of police in a context like that, then clearly a lot of consciousness raising, awareness raising needs to be done on a mass scale to educate Americans in general about the fact that police officers are not angels and about the need to hold them accountable. So, without going into too much more detail or boring you with an excessively long video, I'm going to just sum up by saying there's a personal dimension to this problem too. And it's especially personal when you're talking about the police officer himself, who may pull out his gun, maybe too quick on the draw, and too quick to use maximum force when dealing particularly with young black men. I remember having a conversation about that very subject with my physical therapist last week, when she mentioned that it always seems like, police brutality, a lot of people of different backgrounds fall victim to it. There are whites who fall victim to police brutality, but they always seem to be more likely, the police seem to be more likely to use deadly force with us in particular, with black men and particularly young black men. You'll hear a lot of cases in which, the police use chokeholds and on white suspects or suspects of various backgrounds, or are likely to beat them up with nightsticks or what have you. But when it's a shooting, a fatal shooting, and I don't have the statistics to back this up, but when it comes to the media coverage at least, and we all know how flawed that is, it seems as though I get the impression that, when it's a case of a police officer shooting someone fatally, usually that someone is black and young and male. So it's as if the police feel that they have to use and apply Colin Powell's doctrine of invincible force when dealing with black men. And there certainly is research out there to indicate that police are more likely to use, well, not research, as I say, but there have been testimonials by current and former police officers that, based on their experience, they would say police do use excessive force more when they're dealing with blacks than with people of other backgrounds. So, again, there are systemic reasons for that, and certainly, I think the systemic factors are the major factor when you're talking about the failure of the justice system to hold police accountable in these cases. But I think there is still a personal dimension as well, especially if you're talking about biased police officers, biased prosecutors, biased jury members, biased judges too, I'm sure, in many cases. So I think that the personal dimension of American racism and of prejudice more generally in this country and abroad is a problem that needs to be considered and tackled along with the systemic factors. I don't think you can just isolate the systemic issues and zero in on those to the exclusion of the personal dimension of the problem. So that's my take on it. I definitely respect the efforts of those who seek to point out the systemic factors that keep minorities down in this country, that disadvantage us in many cases and in many ways. But let's not pretend that personal prejudice plays no role in the problem either. That's definitely not the case at all. So that's my latest 2 cents, and you all know the drill. Feel free to comment, feel free to share, feel free to retweet or what have you, and I look forward to hearing you guys' take on this. Thanks a lot. Have a nice night.